Ethan Miller was 16 when his uncle told him to get out. No warning, no goodbye. Just a slurred sentence and a finger pointing toward the door. Snow was falling sideways that night, thick and heavy, the kind that swallowed sound and erased footprints within minutes. Ethan stood on the porch with his worn backpack and one shaking hand on Buddy's collar. Buddy, a scruffy brown mutt with cloudy eyes and a crooked ear, leaned into him as if he understood exactly what was happening. They didn't have a plan, they just walked. The road out of town was dark and silent, lined with frozen trees and abandoned sheds. Ethan's boots were too thin for the cold. Each step sent a sharp sting up his legs. Buddy limped beside him, paws slipping on the ice, breathing in short, nervous bursts. After an hour, Ethan spotted an old house near the edge of the woods. Its windows were boarded, its porch sagging like a tired spine. No lights, no smoke, no sound. But it had something else. Space underneath. The house sat high off the ground, lifted on wooden beams. Wind howled through the gap below it, but when Ethan crawled under, he felt something strange. It was warmer. Not warm, just less cruel. The snow outside burned his face. Under the house, the air felt dull and still, like it had forgotten how cold it was supposed to be. Buddy immediately curled up in the dirt, tail tucked tight, body pressed against Ethan's leg. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter and listened. Above him, the floor creaked in the wind. Below him, the earth was hard but not frozen solid. He stared at his breath floating in front of his face. "Guess this is home for tonight," he whispered. They stayed there through the night. The cold crept in slowly, but not like it did outside. Buddy slept. Ethan didn't. He watched moonlight slip through broken boards and noticed something important. Every time the wind died down, it felt warmer again. The next morning, his stomach ached with hunger. He dug into his bag and found one crushed granola bar. He split it in half, giving the bigger piece to Buddy. While Buddy chewed, Ethan rolled an empty can that had fallen from his bag. It bounced across the dirt and stopped near the center of the space. That's when he noticed it. Right under the middle of the house, the ground was dry, and the air felt different, almost protected. Ethan placed his palm on the soil. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't dead either. He sat there for a long time, staring at the low ceiling of wood and dust. He remembered something his science teacher once said. Heat moves, it spreads. It doesn't just rise, it leaks. The house above him had once been lived in. It had held fires, people, warmth. "What if," he murmured. Buddy lifted his head. "What if this isn't just a place to hide," Ethan said. "What if it could be something else?" The thought scared him. He was just a kid, a runaway, a nobody with a dog and no money. But Buddy was shivering again, and Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, something stubborn and determined. He wasn't going to freeze here. He wasn't going to let Buddy freeze either. Under that broken house in the silent cold, an idea was forming. Not a miracle, not a dream. A risky, desperate plan. And for the first time since being thrown out, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt all night. Hope. By morning, the wind had buried their tracks in fresh snow. Ethan crawled out from under the house, stiff and aching, his fingers numb and his knees muddy. Buddy followed, shaking dirt from his fur and sneezing like he'd caught a cold from the earth itself. They spent the day scavenging. Ethan walked into town with Buddy close to his leg, checking trash bins behind the grocery store, looking for bottles to return, anything that might turn into a few dollars. People stared. Some whispered. A man at the gas station muttered, "Kids should be in school," and shook his head. Ethan kept walking. That night, back under the house, he couldn't stop thinking about the strange warmth he'd felt. The memory stuck to him like smoke. He pressed his hand against the floorboards overhead. Cold wood, but not frozen. Heat moved, he knew that much. 2 days later in the public library, mostly to stay warm, he found an old home repair magazine in a dusty rack. The cover showed a simple greenhouse made from scrap wood and window glass. He stared at it for a long time. A greenhouse, under a house. The idea felt ridiculous the moment it formed. He imagined telling someone and hearing them laugh. A homeless kid building a garden in winter? With what tools? With what money? Still, he couldn't shake it. In a thrift store on Main Street, he found a torn farm catalog from the previous year. Folded between pages was an ad for cheap cold-frame windows, wooden frames with glass panels, meant for starting plants early in spring. They cost more than he had. Ethan counted his coins that night. $8.37. Not even close. So he worked. He shoveled snow for an old woman with a bad knee, hauled firewood for a man who smelled like gasoline and regret, cleaned a diner kitchen in exchange for leftover soup and a few wrinkled bills. Buddy waited outside, curled up near warm vents, tail thumping every time Ethan came back out. After a week, Ethan had enough. When he handed over the cash at the feed store counter, the clerk raised an eyebrow. "What are you planting, kid? Pine trees?" "Something like that," Ethan said. The windows arrived 3 days later in a cracked cardboard box. One pane was broken. The others survived. That night, he dragged them under the abandoned house, heart pounding like he was stealing something, even though he'd paid for them fair and square. He didn't sleep much. His mind kept racing ahead of his hands. If he angled the glass toward the sun, if he blocked the wind, if the warmth from the house stayed trapped, maybe, just maybe. The next morning, as he tried to prop one frame against a beam with a piece of rope, two boys from town walked past and stopped. "What's that?" one asked. Ethan didn't answer. The other laughed. "Dude's building a fish tank." They walked off, still laughing. Ethan's face burned, but he didn't stop. He kept adjusting the frame, hands shaking from cold and anger. Buddy barked once, sharp and protective. "I know," Ethan muttered. "It sounds stupid." He leaned back and looked at what he'd built so far. Crooked, fragile, barely standing. But it blocked the wind. And under the glass, the dirt didn't look as dead as before. Ethan pressed his palm to the soil again. Not warm, but not hopeless. He sat there with Buddy beside him, staring at his rough little wall of glass. It wasn't a house, it wasn't a miracle, but it was the first thing he'd built for himself. And for the first time since he'd been kicked out, Ethan felt like he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was trying. The first real snowstorm hit the night Ethan tried to finish his glass wall. Wind slammed against the side of the abandoned house like it wanted inside. Under the floorboards, the cold pressed in from every direction. Ethan worked by the light of a cheap flashlight, his breath puffing out in white clouds while Buddy stayed close, curled into a tight ball of fur and ribs. The glass frames didn't fit the way Ethan had imagined. One was too wide. Another leaned crooked no matter how he wedged it. The rope he'd tied around a support beam kept slipping loose, and every time the wind gusted, the glass rattled like it was about to shatter. "Come on, don't do this now," Ethan whispered, holding one frame steady with his shoulder while trying to hammer a nail with numb fingers. His hand slipped. The nail bent sideways. The hammer hit his thumb. He bit down on his sleeve so Buddy wouldn't hear him yell. For a second, he just sat there in the dirt, blinking hard, pain shooting up his arm. The cold was winning. His body felt slow. His thoughts felt heavier. This was stupid, he told himself. He should have just found another place to hide. Should have kept his head down. Buddy lifted his head and nudged Ethan's knee with his nose. Ethan let out a tired laugh. Yeah, I hear you." He tried again, this time slower. Instead of forcing the frame straight, he angled them, leaning them toward the thin winter sun. He wedged scrap boards between the beams and tied them tight with wire he'd pulled from an old fence. It wasn't pretty, but it held. By morning, 3 frames were standing. The wind still howled outside. But under the house, something had changed. It was quieter. The air felt thicker, trapped. Ethan sat back on his heels and held up his little thermometer, the one he'd found at a yard sale for $1. Outside, 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Under the glass, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. He stared at the numbers like they might disappear. That's above freezing," he said out loud. He didn't cheer. He didn't jump. He just sat there stunned, like someone who had almost drowned and suddenly realized he was breathing again. Over the next few days, Ethan kept improving the space. He packed snow and dirt along the bottom edge of the glass to block drafts. He filled old soda bottles with dark water and lined them along the back wall, hoping they'd soak up sunlight during the day and release heat at night. At the edge of town, behind a closed-down barn, he found a pile of rotting hay and horse manure. It smelled awful. He loaded it into a broken sled anyway and dragged it back, one step at a time. He layered it under the dirt, remembering something he'd once read. Compost made heat when it broke down. The first night after he did that, the temperature climbed again. 42 degrees Fahrenheit, then 45. Ethan lay awake listening to Buddy breathe, afraid it would drop again, afraid the glass would crack, afraid he was fooling himself. But morning came, and the thermometer still hovered just above 40. That's when he dared to do it. From the bottom of his pack, he pulled out a small envelope of seeds he'd bought with his last $2. Lettuce, radishes, and spinach. The cheapest ones on the rack. He used scrap wood to build narrow boxes and filled them with the best soil he could find near the creek. His hands shook as he pressed the seeds into the dirt. "Don't die," he murmured. "Please don't die." Buddy watched from the corner, ears up. Ethan sat back and stared at the dark soil under the glass. Nothing happened. Not right away. But deep beneath the frozen world, under a broken house and a crooked wall of glass, something had begun. Not food yet, not survival, but the chance of it. For the first few days, nothing changed. Ethan checked the soil every morning and every night, crouching under the glass with his flashlight like a doctor waiting for a heartbeat. The dirt stayed dark and still. No movement, no color, just rows of silent earth. He tried not to panic. He boiled water on a small camp stove and let it cool before pouring it gently over the beds. He wiped frost from the inside of the glass with his sleeve. He adjusted the frames when the sun shifted, angling them to catch every weak beam of winter light. Some nights the temperature dipped lower than he wanted. When it did, he wrapped himself and Buddy in their blankets and slept under the glass with them, breathing warmth into the space like it mattered. Buddy never complained, he just pressed closer. On the 8th morning, something was different. Ethan noticed it before he fully understood it. A faint line of green, thin as a thread, breaking through the soil in the first box. He leaned closer. Then he saw another, and another. "Buddy," he whispered. "Buddy, look." Buddy wagged his tail like this was the best news he'd ever heard, even though he had no idea why. By noon, tiny sprouts stood in neat rows. Lettuce first, then radishes. They were pale and fragile, like they didn't quite trust the world yet. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He hadn't just built shelter. He'd made something grow. He started keeping a notebook, marking down the temperature and how tall the plants were each day. When the sun came out, the space felt almost warm. When clouds covered the sky, it felt like holding its breath. A woman from town noticed him one afternoon when he was hauling creek water in a cracked bucket. "What are you doing under that house, honey?" she asked. "Growing food," Ethan said. She blinked. "In winter?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." She followed him. When she saw the plants, she didn't laugh. She didn't question him. She just said, "Lord, you really did it." By the next week, word spread. A man from the feed store came to look. Then 2 boys from school who used to make jokes. They stood quietly staring at the green leaves against the snow. "That's actually working," one of them muttered. Ethan didn't feel proud. He felt careful. Every night he worried something would go wrong, that the glass would crack, that the soil would mold, that the cold would finally win. But the plants kept growing. The lettuce widened into soft leaves. The radishes pushed up thick stems. The spinach darkened into a deeper green. One morning, when the leaves were big enough to hold, Ethan pinched off a few and rinsed them in cold creek water. He shared them with Buddy first, just a little. Then he ate the rest. They tasted like nothing special, and like everything. Fresh, cold, real. The woman from town brought him an old blanket and a sack of dried beans. Someone left scrap wood near the house without saying a word. Another person dropped off an empty glass window frame. Ethan didn't ask questions. He just kept planting. Under the broken house, a small green room was forming. Quiet, stubborn, alive. Outside, snow still covered the ground. Inside, something was changing. Not just the soil. Ethan felt it too. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He wasn't just surviving. People were starting to see him. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan began to wonder what might happen if winter ended, and he was still standing. By the time March loosened winter's grip, the space under the abandoned house no longer looked like a hiding place. It looked like a room, a living one. Rows of lettuce brushed against Ethan's knees when he knelt to water them. Radish leaves spread wide and confident. The spinach had turned a deep, stubborn green. Every morning, light slipped through the tilted glass and painted soft lines across the dirt floor. Ethan harvested carefully, taking only what the plants could spare. He washed the leaves in creek water and shared them when he could. The woman from town came back with a small sack of flour. A man from the feed store left a bag of nails without saying a word. Someone else brought a second window frame and leaned it against the wall. No one laughed anymore. One afternoon, the same clerk who had once raised an eyebrow at Ethan's purchase stood under the glass, hands on his hips. "You know," he said slowly, "people pay good money for plans like this." Ethan shrugged. "I just didn't want us to freeze." The man nodded. "Still, you built something useful." A local paper ran a small story. "Teen survives winter with homemade greenhouse." It didn't mention the nights Ethan slept shivering beside Buddy. It didn't talk about the fear of glass breaking or seeds failing. It just showed a picture of green leaves against snow. Soon people asked questions. How did he keep it warm? What seeds did he use? Would it work under their houses too? Ethan explained what he knew about trapping heat, about blocking wind, about letting sunlight do the work. He wasn't a teacher, but he spoke with quiet confidence because he lived the proof. Spring came slowly. Snow melted into mud. Birds returned to the trees. When the town planted its first outdoor gardens, Ethan was already weeks ahead. One evening, he sat under the glass with Buddy beside him, watching the sky darken through the cracks in the boards above. "We made it," he said softly. Buddy wagged his tail. Ethan thought about the night he'd crawled under that house with nothing but a backpack and a scared dog. He thought about how cold the world had felt, how small he'd felt inside it. Now there were leaves brushing his arms, warm air rising from the soil, a quiet sense that he mattered. He hadn't just grown food, he'd grown a place to belong. And maybe, just maybe, he'd grown a future. Ethan looked down at Buddy and smiled. "Guess we didn't just survive winter," he said. "We changed it." What would you have done if you were Ethan? Would you have kept walking or tried to build something where you stood? If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. More true-to-life survival stories and inspiring journeys are coming soon, because sometimes the smallest shelter becomes the biggest hope.